Hey guys, and welcome back to Credit Kids. So today I'm going to do part 2 of my witches. And if you have not seen my first one, please go check it out. So I hope you guys enjoy. The Grand High Witch. The next day, a man in a black suit arrived at the house, carrying a briefcase, and he held a long conversation with my grandmother in the living room. I was not allowed in while he was there, but when he at last went away, my grandmother came into me. Walking very slowly and looking sad. That man was reading to me your father's will, she said. What is a will? I asked her. It is something you write before you die, she said. And it says that who is going to have your money and your property. But most important of all, it says who is going to look after your child as if the mother and father are both dead. A fearful panic took over me. Did it say you, Grandmama? I cried. I didn't have to go to somebody else, do I? No, she said. Your father would never have done that. He has asked me to take care of you as long as I live. But he has asked that I take you back to your own house in England. He wants us to stay there. But why? I said. Why can't we live in Norway? I would hate to live anywhere else. You told me you would. I know, she said. But there are a lot of complications with money in the house that you wouldn't understand. Also, it said that in the will that although all of your family is Norwegian, you were born in England and you have started your education there, and your father wants to continue going to English schools there. Oh, Grandmama, I cried. You don't want to go live in the English house. I know you don't. Of course I don't, she said. But I'm afraid that we must. Then the will said that your mother felt the same way, and it is important to respect the wishes of your parents. There was no way out of it. We had to go to England, and my grandmother started making arrangements at once. Your next school term begins in a few days, she said, so we don't have any time to waste. On the evening before we left for England, my grandmother got onto one of her favorite subjects again. There are not as many witches in England as there are in Norway, she said. I surely hope I won't meet one, I said. I sincerely hope you won't, my grandmother said. Because those English witches are probably the most vicious in the world. She sat there smoking her foul cigar, talking away. I kept looking at the hand with the missing thumb. I couldn't help it. I was fascinated by it. And I kept wondering what awful thing that happened at the time she had met a witch. It must have been something absolutely appalling and gruesome, otherwise she would have told me about it. Maybe the thumb had been twisted off, or perhaps she had forced to jam her thumb down the spout of a boiling kettle until it was steamed away. Or did someone pull it off her hand like a tooth? I couldn't help try to guess. Tell me what those witches, the English witches, do, Grandmama, I said. Well, she said, sucking away at her stinky cigar. Their favorite ruse is to make a mixed powder that will turn a child into some creature that all grown-ups hate. What sort of creature, Grandmama? Often it's a slug, she said. A slug is one of their favorites. The grown-ups step on the slug and squish it without knowing that their child is it. That's perfectly beastly, I said. Or it might be a flea, my grandmother said. They might turn you into a flea without realizing what she was doing on your own mother would get out the flea powder, and then it's bye-bye for you. You're making me nervous, Grandmama. I don't think I want to go back to England. I know English witches, she went on, who have turned children into pheasants, and they sneak the pheasants up into the woods the very day before pheasant hunting season opened. Ouch, I said. So they get shot? Of course they get shot, she said. and then they got plucked and roasted and eaten for supper. I pictured myself as a pheasant flying drastically over the men with guns, swerving and dipping as the guns exploded by me. Yes, my grandmother said, it gives back the English witches great pleasure to stand back and watch the grown-ups doing away with their own children. I really don't want to go to England, Grandmama. Of course you don't, she said. Nor do I, but I'm afraid we have to. Are witches in every country? I asked. Are witches the same in every country? I asked. Completely different. My grandmother said, but I don't know much about other countries. Don't you know even about in America? I asked. Not really, she answered, although I've heard that the witches were able to make their grown-ups eat their own children. So here we are. That's the pheasant, slug, and flea. Make grown-ups eat their own children. Never, I cried. Oh no, Grandmama, that couldn't be true. I don't know whether it's true or not, she said, but it's only a rumor I've heard. But how could they possibly make them eat their own children? I asked. By turning them into hot dogs, she said. That wouldn't be too difficult for a clever witch. Does every witch in every single country have its own witches? I asked. Wherever you find people, you find witches, my grandmother said. There's a secret society of witches in every country. And do they all know one another, Grandmama? They do not. A witch only knows the witches in her own country. She is strictly forbidden to communicate with any foreign witches. But an English witch, for example, will all know all the other witches in England. They're all friends. They ring up each other, they swoop deadly recipes. Goodness to know what they talk about. I hate to think about it. I sat on the floor watching my grandmother as she put her cigar stub in the ashtray and folded across her hands across her stomach. Once a year, she went on, the witches of each separate country hold their own secret meeting. They get together in one place and receive a lecture from the Grand High Witch of all. From who? I cried. She's the ruler of them all, my grandmother said. She's the all-powerful. She is without mercy. All the other witches are petrified of her. They see her only once a year at an annual meeting. She goes there to whip up excitement and enthusiasm and to give orders. The Grand High Witch travels from country to country attending these annual meetings. Where do they have these meetings, Grandmama? There are all sorts of rumors, my grandmother answered. I have heard it that they just book into a hotel like any other group of women who are holding a meeting. I've also heard it said that some very peculiar things go on in the hotels that they stay in. It is rumored that the beds are never slept in, that there are burnt marks on the carpets and toads discovered in the bathtub, and that down in the kitchen, the cook once found a baby crocodile swimming in a saucepan of soup. My grandmother picked up her cigar and took another puff, inhaling the foul smoke deeply into her lungs. Where does the Grand High Witch live when she's not at home? I asked. Nobody knows, my grandmother said. If we knew that, then she could be rooted out and destroyed. Witchophilies all over the world have spent their lives trying to discover the secret headquarters of the Grand High Witch. What is a witchophily, Grandmama? A person who studies witches and knows a lot about them, my grandmother said. Are you a witchophily, Grandmama? I'm a retired witchophily, she said. When I was younger, I traveled all over the globe to track down the Grand High Witch. I never came close to succeeding. Is she rich? I asked. She's rolling, my grandmother said, simply rolling in money. Rumor has it that there's an exact machine in her headquarters, which is the exact machine that the government use to print off banknotes that you and I use. After all, banknotes are bits of papers with special designs and pictures on them. Anyone can make them who has the right machine and the right paper. My guess is the Grand High Witch makes all the money she wants, and she dishes it out to all the witches everywhere. What about foreign money? I asked. Those machines can make Chinese money if they want them to, my grandmother said. It's only a question of pressing the right button, my grandmama said. If nobody has ever seen the Grand High Witch, how can they be sure she exists? My grandmother gave me a long and very severe look. Nobody has ever seen the devil, she said, but how do we know he exists? The next morning we sailed for England as soon as I went back into the old family house in Kent. But this time we were only my grandmother took me to look after me. Then the Eastern team began looking every weekday I went to school, and everything seemed to have come back to normal again. Now at the bottom of our garden there was an enormous conker tree, and its high up branches, Timmy, my best friend, and I had started building a magnificent treehouse. We were able to work on it only on the weekends, but we were getting along fine. We had begun with the floor, which we built by laying wide planks between two quite far apart branches and nailing them down. Within a month we had finished the floor. Then we constructed only a wooden railing around the floor. That left only, that's the crocodile in the soup, only the roof to be built. The roof was a difficult bit. One Saturday afternoon, when Timmy was in bed with the flu, I decided to start making the roof all by myself. It was lovely being high up there in that conker tree, all along with the pale young leaves coming out everywhere around me. It was like being in a big green cave at the height made it extra exciting. But my grandmother had told me that if I fell down and I would break my leg, and every time I looked down, I got a tingle along my spine. I worked away, nailing the first plank down on the roof. Then suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I immediately caught the sight of a woman standing immediately below me. She was looking up at me and smiling in the most peculiar way. When most people smile, their lips go out sideways. This woman's lip went upward and downwards, showing all of her teeth and front gums. The gums were like raw meat. It is a shock to discover that you are alone and being watched when you think you are alone. And what was this strange woman doing in our garden anyway? I noticed that she was wearing a small black hat and black gloves on her hands, and the gloves came up all the way to her elbows. Gloves! She was wearing gloves. I froze all over. I have a present for you, she said, staring at me still smiling, still showing her teeth and gums. I didn't answer. Come down out of that tree, little boy, she said. I shall give you the most exciting present you've ever had. Her voice was curious, raspy quality. It made a sort of metallic sound as though her throat was full of drain pipes. Without taking her eyes off my face, she slowly put one of the gloved hands into her purse and drew out a small green snake. She held it up to me for me to see. It's tamed, she said. The snake began to coil itself around her forearm. It was brilliantly green. If you come down here, I shall give him to you, she said. Oh, Grandmama, I thought, come and help me. Then I panicked. I dropped the hammer and shot up the enormous tree like a monkey. I didn't stop until I was high as I could possibly go, and there I stayed, quivering in fear. I couldn't see the woman now. There were many layers and layers of leaves between me and her. I stayed up for a few hours. I kept very still. It began to grow dark. At last I heard my grandmother calling my name. I'm up here, I shouted back. Come down here at once, she called out. It's past supper time. Grandmama, I shouted, has the woman gone? What woman? My grandmother called back. The woman in the black gloves. There was silence below. I thought It was silence of someone who was too stunned to speak. "Grandmama!" I shouted. "Has she gone?" "Yes," my grandmother answered at last. "She's gone. I'm here, my darling. I'll look after you. You can come down now." I climbed down. I was trembling. My grandmother engulfed me in her arms. "I've seen a witch," I said. "Come inside," she said. "You'll be all right with me." She led me into the house and gave me a cup of hot cocoa with lots of sugar in it. "Tell me everything," she said. I told her. By the time I had finished, it was my grandmother who was trembling. Her face was ashy gray, and I saw a glance down her at the hand of hers that she didn't have a thumb on. You know what this means," she said. "It means there's one of them in our district. From now on, I'm not letting you walk to school alone." "Do you think she could be after me especially?" I asked. "No, I doubt that. One child is as good as any others to those two creatures. It is hardly surprising that after that I became a very witch-conscious little boy. If I happened to be alone on a road and I saw a woman approaching who was wearing gloves, I would quickly skip across to the other side." As the weather remained pretty cold during the whole of that month, nearly everyone was wearing gloves. Curiously enough, I never saw the woman with the green snake ever again. That was my first witch, but not my last. Summer holidays. The Eastern times came and went. The summer term began at school. My grandmother and I had already planned to take our summer holiday in Norway, and we talked about nothing else every evening. She had booked a cabin for us at one of the boats on the boat from Newcastle to Oslo at the earliest possible moment after my school broke up. From Oslo, she was going to take me to a place she knew down the south coast near Arendal, where she had spent her own summer holidays as a child nearly 80 years ago. All day long, she said, my brother and I were out in the rowing boat. The whole coast is dotted with tiny islands, and there's nobody on them. We used to explore them and dive into the sea off them, the lovely smooth granite rocks, and sometimes the way we would drop the anchor and fish cod in waiting. And if we caught anything, we would build a fire on the island and fry fish in a pan for lunch. There is no finer fish in the world than absolutely fresh cod. What did you use the bait, Grandmama, when you went fishing? Mussels, she said. Everyone uses mussels for bait in Norway. And if we didn't catch any fish, we would boil the mussels in a saucepan and eat those. Were they good? Delicious, he said. Cook them in seawater and they're tender and salty. What else did you do, Grandmama? We used to row out and wave the shrimp boats on their way home. And they would stop and give us handfuls of shrimps each. The shrimps were still warm from having been just cooked, and we would sit them in the rowing boat and peeling them and gobbling them up. The head was the best part. The head? I said. You squeeze the head between your teeth and suck out the inside. It's marvelous. You and I will do all these things this summer, my darling, she said. Grandmama, I said, I can't wait. I simply can't wait to go. Nor can I, she said. When there were only 3 weeks of summer term left, an awful thing happened. My grandmother got pneumonia. She became very ill, and a trained nurse moved into the house to look after her. The doctor explained to me that pneumonia is not normally a dangerous illness nowadays because of penicillin, but when a person is more than 80 years old, as my grandmother was, then it is very dangerous indeed. He said that he didn't even dare to move her in her condition, so she stayed in her bedroom, and I hung out in the side of the door while oxygen cylinders and all sorts of other frightening things were taken into her. Can I go in and see her? I asked. No, dear, the nurse said. Not at the moment. A fat, jolly lady called Mrs. Spring, who used to come over and clean our house every day, also moved in and slept in the house. Mrs. Spring looked after me and cooked my meals. I liked her very much, but she wasn't a patch on my grandmother for telling stories. One evening, about 10 days later, the doctor came downstairs and said to me, "You can go in and see her now. Only for a short time. She's been asking for you." I flew up the stairs and burst into my grandmother's room and threw myself into her arms. There is the grandmother in her bed. "Hey there," the nurse said. "Be careful with her." "Will you be all right now, Grandmama?" I asked. "The worst is over," she said. "I'll soon be up again." "Will she?" I asked of the nurse. "Oh, yes," the nurse answered. "She told us she simply had to get better because she had to look after you." I gave her another hug. "They won't let me have a cigar," she said, "but you wait till they're gone." "She's a tough old bird," the nurse said. "We'll have her up in another week." The nurse was right. Within a week my grandmother was thumping around the house with her gold-topped cane and flirting with Mrs. Spring's cooking. "I thank you for all your help, Mrs. Spring," she said, "but you can go home now." "Oh, I can't, Mrs. Spring. Doctor told me to see that you take it very easy for the next few days." The doctor said more than that. He dropped a bombshell on my grandmother and me by telling us that no account we would risk the journey to Norway this summer. "Rubbish!" my grandmother cried. "I promised him we'll go." "It's too far," the doctor said. "It would be very dangerous. But I'll tell you what you can do. You can take your grandson to the nice hotel on the south coast of England and say, 'The sea air is just what you need.'" "Oh, no," I said. "Do you want your grandmother to die?" the doctor said. "Never," I said. "Then don't let her go on a long journey this summer. She's not yet strong enough, and stop her smoking those vile black cigars." In the end, the doctor had his way about the holiday, but not the cigars. Rooms were booked for us in a place called the Hotel Magnificent in the famous seaside town of Bournemouth. Bournemouth, my grandmother told me, was full of old people like herself. They were tired by there because the air was so bracing and healthy it kept for them, so they believed alive for an extra few years. "Does it?" I asked. "Of course not," she said. "It's Tomorrow. But just for once I think we've got to obey the doctor." Soon after that my grandmother and I took the train to Bournemouth and settled in at the Hotel Magnificent. It was an enormous white building on the seafront, and it looked pretty much to me like a boring place to spend the summer holiday in. I had my own separate bedroom, but there was a door connecting my room with my grandmother's room, so we could just visit each other without going into the corridor. Just before we left Bournemouth, my grandmother had given me a consultation, a present of 2 wet mice in a little cage, and of course I took them with me. They were terrific fun. Those mice, I called them William and Mary, and in the hotel I set out right away teaching them how to do tricks. The first trick I taught them was how to creep up the sleeve of my jacket and come onto my neck. Then I taught them how to climb out the back of my neck to the top of my head. By this far I've been putting cake crumbs in my hair. On the very first morning of our arrival, the chambermaid was making my bed when one of the mice poked out of its head under one of the sheets. The maid let out a shriek and brought a dozen people running to see who was being murdered. I was reported to the manager. There followed an unpleasant scene in the manager's office with the manager, my grandmother, and me. The manager, who was Mr. Stringer, was a bristle man in a black tailcoat. "I cannot permit mice in my hotel, madam," he said to my grandmother. "How dare you say that when your rotten hotel is full of rats anyways?" my grandmother cried. "Rats!" Mr. Stringer cried Mr. Stringer, going to maneuver in the face. "There are no rats in this hotel. I saw one this morning," my grandmother said. "It was running down the corridor into the kitchen." "That is not true," cried Mr. Stringer. "You had better rat catcher at once." "You had better get the rat catcher in this at once," my grandmother said, "before I report you to the public health authorities. I expect the scuttling all over the kitchen floor and stealing the food off the shelves and jumping in and out of the soup." So that is Mr. Stringer and the grandmother and the boy. That's the boy and the boy. Same thing. Same guy. "Never!" cried Mr. Stringer. "No wonder my breakfast toast was nibbled on the round of the edges this morning," my grandmother went on relentlessly. "No wonder it had a nasty ratty taste. If you're not careful, the health people will be ordering the entire hotel to be closed before everyone gets typhoid fever." "You're not being serious, madam," Mr. Stringer said. "I was never more serious in my life," my grandmother said. Are you or are you not going to allow my grandson to keep his white mice in this room?" The manager knew that he was beaten. "May I suggest a compromise, madam?" he said. "I will permit him to keep them in his room as long as they're never allowed out of the cage. How's that?" "That will suit us very well," my grandmother said, and she stood up and marched out of the room with me behind her. There's no way you can train my mice inside of a cage, yet I dare not to let them out because the chambermaid was spying on me all the time. She had a key to my door and she kept bursting in all hours, trying to catch me with the mice out of the cage. She told me that the first mouse to break the rule would have to be drowned in a bucket of water by the hall porter. I decided to seek a safer place where I could carry on with their training. There must surely be an empty room in this enormous hotel. I put one mouse into each trouser pocket and wandered downstairs in search of a secret spot. The ground floor of the hotel was a maze of public rooms, all of them named in golden letters on the doors. I wandered through the lounge and the smoking room and the card room and the reading room and the drawing room. None of them was empty. I went down to a long corridor, and at the end of it I came across the ballroom. There was double doors leading into it, and at the front of the doors was a large notice board standing. I noticed the board say, RSPCC meeting, strictly private. This room is reserved for an annual meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. The double doors into the room were open. I peeped in. It was a colossal room. There were rows and rows of chairs, all facing a platform. Their chairs were painted gold and had little red cushioned seats on them. But there was no soul in sight. So there's the RSPCC. So Royal Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Children. Well, they're lying. I sidled cautiously into the room. What a lovely, secret, silent place it was. The meeting of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children must have taken place earlier in the day, and now they've all gone home. Even if they hadn't, even if they did suddenly come in, pouring in, they would be wonderfully kind, would look for a favor upon a young mouse trainer going back to his business. At the back of the room there's a large folding screen with the Chinese dragons painted on it. I decided just to be safe to go behind the screen for doing my training there. I wasn't a bit frightened about the prevention of cruelty to children, but there were a chance that Mr. Stringer, the manager, might pop his head around the door. If he saw the mice, the poor things would be in the hall porter's bucket of water before I could shout stop. I tiptoed to the back of the room and settled myself into the thick green carpet. behind the big screen. What a splendid time this place was! Ideal for my mouse training. I took William and Mary out of the trouser pockets. They sat beside me on the carpet and quietly behaved. The trick was I was going to teach them today how to tightrope walk. This is a difficult thing to train, and an intelligent mouse had to be an expert tightrope walker provided you know exactly how to go about it. First, you must have a piece of string. I had that. Next, you must have some good cake. A fine currant cake is the favorite food of white mice. So that is the giant hall of the RSPCC. They are jolly about it. I had brought with me a rock cake, which I had pocketed while having tea with my grandmother today. Now here's what you do. You stretch the string tight between your two hands, but you start by keeping it very short, only about 3 inches. You put the mouse on your right hand and the little piece of cake on your left. The mouse, therefore, only has 3 inches away from the cake. He can see it and he can smell it. His whiskers twitched with excitement. He can almost reach the cake by leaning forward, but not quite. His whiskers twitched with excitement. He can almost reach the cake by leaning forward, but not quite. He only has 2 take steps stretching forward, and he ventures forward on one paw with the string, then onto the other. If the mouse had a good sense of balance, and the most of them have, he will get across easily. I started with William. He walked the string out of a moment's hesitation. I let him have a quick nibble of the cake just to whet his appetite. Then I put him back on my right hand. This time I lengthened the string. It made it about 6 inches long. William knew what to do now. With superb balance, he walked step by step along the string until he reached the cake. He was rewarded with another nibble. Quite soon after, William was walking a 24-inch tightrope, or rather tight string, from one hand to the other to reach the cake. It was wonderful to watch him. He enjoyed it himself tremendously. I was careful to hold the string near the carpet so I wouldn't have to lose his balance and wouldn't have to fall for him. But he never fell. William was obviously a natural acrobat. He was getting a great tightrope walking mouse. Now it was Mary's turn. I put William on the carpet beside me and rewarded him with getting some extra combs and a currant. Then I started going through my same routine all over again with Mary. My blinding ambition, you see, my dream of dreams, was to one day own a white mouse circus, and I would have a small stage with red curtains in front of it. When the curtains were drew apart, the audience would see my world-famous performing mice walking on a tightrope, swinging from trapezes, turning some somersaults in the air, bouncing up and down on trampolines, all over the rest of it. So that's him training his mice right there. I would have the white mice riding on white rats, and the rats would gallop fiercely around the stage. I was beginning to picture myself traveling first class around the globe with my famous white mice circus, and performing before all the crowned heads of Europe. I was about halfway through Mary's training when suddenly I heard a voice outside the ballroom. The door grew louder. It swelled a great babble of speech through many throats. I recognized that awful hotel manager, Mr. Stringer. Help, I thought, but thank heavens for a huge screen. I crouched behind it and peered through the crack between the two folded sections. I could see the entire width of the ballroom without anyone seeing me. "Well, ladies, I'm sure you will be quite comfortable in here," Mr. Stringer's voice was saying. Then, through the double doors he marched, black coattail all, spreading his arms wide as he ushered the great flock of ladies. "If there is anything we can do for you, do not hesitate. Let me know," he went on. "Tea will be served after all of your meetings on the Sunshine Terrace after you have concluded your meeting." With that he bowed and scraped himself out of the room as a vast herd of ladies from the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children came streaming in. They wore pretty clothes and all of them had hats on their heads. The meeting. Now that the manager had gone, I was not particularly alarmed. What better than to do to be imprisoned in a room full of these splendid ladies? If I ever got talking to them, I might have suggested that they come up to do with a bit of cruelty to children preventing at my school. We could certainly use them there. And then came in talking off their heads. They began milling around and choosing their seats, and there was a whole lot of stuff like, "Come and sit next to me, Millie dear. Oh, hello, Beatrice. I haven't seen you since the last meeting. What a adorable dress you have on." I decided to stay where I was and let them go with their meeting while I was doing my mouse train. But I watched for a while longer throughout the crack in the scene, waiting for them to settle down. How many were there? I guessed about 200. The back rows filled up first. They all seemed to want to sit back farther from the platform as possible. There was a lady wearing a tiny green hat in the middle of the back row who kept scratching on the nape of her neck. She couldn't leave it alone. It fascinated me the way her fingers kept scratching away at the hair at the back of her neck. Had she known somebody who was watching her from behind, I'm sure she would have been embarrassed. I wondered if she had danger. All of a sudden, I noticed the lady next to her was doing the same thing, and the next one, and the next. The whole line of them were doing it, then scratching away like mad at their hair at the back of their necks. Did they have fleas in their hair? More likely it was nits. A boy at school, Cat Ashton, had nits in his hair last term, and matron made him dip his whole head into turnip tea. It killed the nits right off his head, but it nearly killed Ashton as well. Half of the skin came off of his scalp. So here are the the prevention of cruelty to children. I began to be fascinated by the hair scratching ladies. It is always funny when you catch someone doing something gross and think no one is looking. Nose picking, for example, or scratching her bottom. Hair scratching is very nearly as unattractive, especially if it goes on and on. I decided it has to be nits. Then the more astonishing thing happened. I saw one lady pushing her fingers up underneath her hair, and then the entire head of her hair lifted upwards all in one piece, and then the hand slid underneath the hair and went on scratching. She was wearing a wig. They were all wearing gloves. I glanced swiftly around the rest of the seated audience. Every one of them was wearing gloves. My blood turned to ice. I began to shake all over. I glanced frantically behind me at the back door escape through. There wasn't one. Should I leap out behind the doors and make a dash for the double doors? Those double doors were already closed, and I could see a woman standing in front of them. She was bending forward, fixing some kind of metal chain around the two door handles. Keep still, I told myself. No one will see you yet. There's no reason in the world why you should come and look behind the screen. But one false move, one cough, one sneeze, one noticeable, one little sound of any sort it won't be just one witch that gets you. 200. At this point, I think I fainted, but the whole thing was altogether too much for a small boy to cope with. But I don't believe that I was out for more than a few seconds when I came to. I was lying on the carpet, and I was still, thank heavens, behind the screen. There was absolute silence around, absolute silence around me. Rather shakily, I got to my knees and peered through once again, and through the crack in the screen. So, thank you guys for watching. Stay tuned for part 3 of The Witches. So, I hope you guys really like this. I think you guys probably know who the RSPCC is already. I hope you guys do, because if you know who it is, then yeah, because I'm not going to tell you anymore. So, thank you guys for watching. Please subscribe. Stay tuned for part 3 of The Witches.